And we continue our look now at today's May auto sales numbers with auto industry analyst Rebecca Lindland, Director of Strategic Review at IHS Automotive. She joins us now from Boston. Rebecca, welcome back to Bottom Line. Always good to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me on again, Mark.
Rebecca, from January through April, auto sales increased about 20% year over year. What happened, and is the U.S. auto industry in for a tough summer?
You know, it's a combination of things that has happened to the industry this month as we look at sales in the maybe mid-12s, probably lower than that. Looking over all the press reports that we have, it's clear that the Japanese have serious issues with supply because we're seeing Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Subaru all with negative numbers. When we look at the domestics, we're seeing GM, Ford, and Chrysler also with some pretty soft sales, except for Chrysler, which was up 10%. But in part because they're not playing the financial game in terms of incentives. And then we see Hyundai and Kia, and they've had their best sales months in May in years. So clearly it's a matter of supply and money.
Well, Rebecca, you mentioned incentives between now and the end of the year. Are the automakers going to have to take another look at that? Because they had been cut, the incentives had been cut, at least in part to preserve inventory, but now the automakers are raising some prices because the cost of raw materials are going up.
I think it's less about incentives and more about value. And I'm basing that, again, when we look at Hyundai and Kia. We also look at Volkswagen. They had one of their best May months in 7 years. Porsche sales are up 50%. It's not so much about incentives, but about providing the right product and the right value to the consumer right now.
Well, the conference board says that the percentage of consumers planning to buy a new vehicle within 6 months fell in May to 3.3%, and that's the lowest level since January. Are consumers waiting for better deals or a wider selection before they make a purchase?
I think they're really waiting for a few things. They are certainly waiting for possibly some supplies to come back into the showroom because they've heard a lot about the disruptions because of the Japan crises. But also, we've seen horrible economic numbers coming out. Manufacturing, employment, housing. The housing report the last couple of days has been dreadful. So I think the consumers are still very, very concerned about the economy, both their own household economic conditions and the jobs as well.
And speaking of worried about the economy, the high price of gas, the average now about $3.78 a gallon nationwide. How high a priority is fuel economy for potential buyers, or are they just resigned to the fact that no matter what type of car they drive, gas prices are always going to fluctuate?
No, we're definitely seeing the consumer selecting the most fuel-efficient versions of the vehicles they want to buy. So we're seeing things like the Ford Fusion, where they're at 80% for four-cylinder engines, where typically they had been at 50% a few years ago. We're also seeing GM reported over 50% for their cars and trucks. So we're seeing a lot of selections of 4- and 6-cylinder vehicles.
And you speak of fuel efficiency, those models that we're seeing. Are we now seeing a supply and demand scenario play out? Some dealers are charging more for fuel-efficient cars.
Well, we are to some extent. We still are not seeing significant increases in hybrid sales. Hybrids continue to languish at less than 3% of the market because we're really seeing consumers appreciate what the industry's been able to accomplish with just traditional direct injection or internal combustion engines, and they feel like that provides a better value for them. It always seems to get back to value these days.
Rebecca, will auto sales through the end of the year make up for the current sales declines we're seeing?
Not entirely. In March, we had a forecast of 13.3 million units for 2011, and right now we're at 12.7 because of the oil crisis and because of Japan. We may be able to increase that in the next couple of months, but we're really watching it pretty closely.
Rebecca, in our last minute, Treasury Secretary Geithner, he had an op-ed in the Washington Post today, and I'd like to read part of what he said because he was talking about the U.S. bailout of the auto industry. He said, all 3 American automakers have returned to profitability. The industry has added new shifts, and he went on to say, and 115,000 jobs, and GM and Chrysler have returned more than 50% of the government's investment. The industry is mounting one of the most improbable turnarounds in recent history. I was wondering if I could get your comments on the Secretary's remarks.
Well, I think all those things are true. I mean, this is an industry that was really on life support, truly, and we sold 10 million units a couple years ago, which was really unheard of. And then we've actually been able to come back, and we've been coming back in an economy that hasn't really helped. And we've been hit by natural disasters, by oil crises, by all these different things, and yet it still is showing a level of resiliency. We're also seeing new plants opening up. Volkswagen just opened up their new plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee last week. So we're starting to see manufacturing return to the U.S., which will help us overall with better jobs and better economy.
Rebecca Lindland, Director of Strategic Review at IHS Automotive, joining us from Boston. It's always a pleasure to have you on, Rebecca. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you.
Well, coming up.